ahead start. And I have prepared, in fact, I'm suffering too, because I prepared really the kind of introduction that Nancy deserves. And he has ordered me to keep it short. So I don't know. Yeah. Okay, so but I am totally delighted that Nancy is such a vibrant personality that you have to leave this protected zone.
Yeah. We can do
Be
this.
great, go ahead. No harm will come to you, sit there, I don't think. Okay, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Nancy Peluso. Nancy has researched smallholders, workers, and land transformations in Indonesia for more than 35 years. She joined our faculty in 1996 from Yale and developed a program quickly in political ecology that's been important to generations of students. She is now the Henry J. Box Distinguished Professor of Forest Policy, a Guggenheim Fellow, and the holder of the 2019 Alamo Environmental Peace Building Award, and she runs our beloved Land Lab. Now, Nancy takes mentorship of students very, very seriously. I know that because many of my students have worked with her. And she's the hardest working faculty member I know in the interest of her students and all the other students that have worked with her. Her work focuses on the management of natural resources and landscapes in Indonesia, with special attention to the ways changing political regimes affect the lives of people engaged in the exploitation of natural resources. She's worked on the effect of remittances from women who have migrated to cities on economic life in their regions of origin. Those are fascinating talks, and the ways in which small-scale gold mining has affected resource territories in Indonesia and Borneo. She had an exhibit, a dramatic photo exhibit at the Berkeley Art Library not too long ago in a publication in Mandala Life that features her photographs, and they are absolutely wonderful. Her photographs focus on miners, labor and their lives, their working landscapes, and their life or death dependence on each other every time they enter a mining pit or a tunnel. The exhibit is still on the web, and I encourage you to visit the site. It's a wonderful collection of photographs. Photos of people in particular really struck me because they reflect the compassion and very deep affection with which she views her subjects. The photos are insightful and beautiful, and I hope we can count on creative work in the future. Thank you, Ms. for being here.
Okay, well, we'll see how this goes. I've been working on this talk for a month and a half and I trashed it last night. So that's how it really goes. Okay, so I'm going to talk about something today that I call the Plantation-Migration Nexus. It actually has a different title than what's on the slide due to previous comment. So I'm going to pretty much just launch. I'm going to start out by showing you a few pictures to just think about scenes from this new montane remittance forest in East Java where I work. Because I know this is a mixed audience, I decided to provide some definitions so that theory would become clear to everyone. Of course, the definitions are completely difficult, but we'll see. So I'm going to be talking about something called the Plantation-Migration Nexus. This is a new term that I and my partners of research have coined. It's about the entanglements and the articulations of very varied plantation formations and migration modalities, which just means differences. Okay. Each of these alone, plantations and migration, are major drivers of agrarian change, and they operate differently when we take them together. Okay. Third, political forests. What is a political forest? A political forest is basically an institutional manifestation in the landscape that has territorial, species, and labor controls built into the idea of governance by particular political entities. They operate on tracts of forest land, so there's ways in which forest land is territorially controlled by the kinds of species that are planted there, and the ways that people have access to those forest lands through rules and forest laws, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, remittance forests are a kind of political forest. They're also a plantation forest in which the understory is used, at least in my case today, by migrant workers and their families, or by forest workers or forest villagers. And the reason we call it a remittance forest is that the things that they're doing in the understory, basically, are funded directly or indirectly by wages that are earned during migration. Okay, and finally, these remittance forests, like I said, remittance houses are houses that are literally built with savings and remittances sent from transnational or transinsular, in the case of Indonesia, work sites to home villages. And on plantations, remittance houses are political statements to the landlords. And you should be an expert in that at the end of this talk. Okay. The other thing I'm talking about in this lecture is so-called social reproduction. This is not group sex, despite the name. But it is. I didn't say any better. We use it, people use it, social scientists use it as a window into this plantation migration nexus that I'm talking about. One definition of it, there's lots of definitions of it, but a basic definition of it is that the activities and attitudes, behaviors, and emotions that are directly involved in the maintenance of life on a daily basis and intergenerationally, okay? It can include how food, clothing, and shelter are made available, and the ways in which the care and socialization of children are provided, care for the elderly and infirm, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's been a new revival of this concept lately, and a lot of it has to do with land, resource production, agrarian change, and so on. And what this basically means is the abilities to access and control land and various resources. Those contribute to social reproduction, the ability to socially reproduce, not necessarily to be exactly the same from one generation to the next or from one year to the next, but to be able to kind of move forward in your life and in your family's life or in a community's life, or even as a laborer on a plantation, or the social reproduction of the plantation itself. All of these things can be used to kind of think about whether you're moving forward in a positive way or if things are just getting more and more dire as time goes on. Okay, if you can't socially reproduce, it's kind of the beginning of a decline. Okay, and the other thing to be thinking about, well, I mean, I'm not gonna. Okay, so let me just start out by saying, first of all, thank you to all of you for coming today. I was afraid I would be addressing an empty room, and Mr. Howell here. You know, I also have to give thanks to NSF, to the Fulbright Foundation, and perhaps most importantly, to the 10 years of support that I received as the Henry J. Vaux Distinguished Lecturer in Forest Policy that is given in this college. And of course, there's a lot more I could say about that. I have some acknowledgements at the end of my talk. What I want to say, though, today is that I think that the establishment and spread of plantations and the massive migrations that we hear about every single day in one way or another, positive or negative, in their many modalities. See, here's a new word you have to learn by the end of this talk. That these are two of the most important, if not the most important, trends in rural areas around the globe today. Okay. Intellectually, they're enshrined in two literatures, right? Agrarian change literature but also more specific literature, the plantation-Migration literature. Plantation-Migration, now many of you probably heard of the capital OC, and Jason Moore has made sure of that. And basically, it's a way of thinking about an era of human and actually planetary history in which capital and capitalism has been a very important driving factor. Now, the plantation-Migration says, okay, but from the very outset, plantations were part of that transition, okay? And that's basically what the plantation-Migration means. There's a very famous recent article that was written by Wendy Wolford, who came from this geography department, is now at Cornell. And basically, she talks about what is it that constitutes the plantation-Migration. Is that a useful way for us, for social scientists, also to be thinking about these very specific things that come in? And this is a great article, but what it doesn't really do, although it mentions migration, you can't talk about plantations without thinking in some way about migration. Whether it's because people are dispossessed and they go off, or whether it's because people are walking in to get work, or whether it's because plantations are competing with each other in the same region, and so people are traveling between them. All these things are often part of the same plantations' histories, okay? And so the plantation-Migration material is wonderful, but it's at such a large scale. It's a world systems theory kind of a project, to talk about the plantation-Migration and to find similarities across nations, across continents, and so on, that we can say this is something that's happening everywhere. Okay, so I'm not going to go into that in great deal, but the main thing is that I'm much more of a kind of regional political ecologist who thinks at the regional level, that for me, we can really see things happening and have a lot more fun doing it. If in fact, we're talking to people in what now we're calling for our plantation migration nexus stuff, we're thinking about village concession landscapes. Okay, because many concessions have villages that are either integrated into the concession, or their land stolen from by the concession, or they're located on the edges of a concession. It's a landscape that's a kind of middle level way of looking at things. It's a middle level kind of scale or level that you might want to think about. So anyway, so I'm working in this place in East Java, where I basically showed you a few pictures earlier, and I want to read you this this comment by a friend of mine in this forest plantation. It's specifically in a workers' settlement, and you'll be hearing a lot about that in this talk. And she said, we were going around interviewing as many people as we could as soon as we got there. And asking them about their experiences with migration and a little bit about their own family genealogies. We use family genealogies as a way of getting at the kinds of work that ancestors did, the ways that their lives had changed, whether a migration was part of their lives or not. Okay, so it wasn't really just a kinship kind of exercise. It was basically looking at these other things that were going to help us as we were thinking about migration in the plantation. And she said all 5 of our adult children were born on this forest plantation, and they've all worked in Hong Kong or Taiwan. All 5 of them sent money to renovate our house in the workers' settlement. 4 of the 5 built houses on private land that they bought with their savings from work overseas. That's all her children. All her children. Actually, after this, the other ones went to Hong Kong or Taiwan. And that was exactly why we wanted to interview her, because she and her husband had been among the first that were settled in this forest worker settlement in the 50s. And she was even the daughter of a man who worked with the foresters. So you'd think that these kinds of connections might change what was possible for them in the future, but no. They had all of their children migrating, and in fact, her oldest daughter was one of the first ones to go migrate, and her sister, who was the first one to migrate, to Hong Kong, for 10 years or so. So her oldest daughter is still in Hong Kong. She's been there for 24 years. Yeah, she went in 2000 and has been there 24 years. I saw her in Hong Kong last summer. And she's become a very good friend and has informed a lot of the way I think about all of this. Okay, so I'm just gonna do a little quickie on the map. We might come back to here if we need to. This is just a general map in progress because I'm working with someone in Indonesia and the time zone is killing me. It's really hard, but because I don't do these things myself. I just order people around on this kind of thing. But anyway, so what we've got here are parts of two different villages, the parts that were closest to the forest. And that in fact, each of the parts in one village called Lurup, if you can say that 5 times fast, you're gonna get a prize at the end of the talk. And Nyawangan, which is much easier to say. Each of these two villages had a private plantation, one a tea plantation and a rubber plantation attached to it, so they're on either side. And then all that kind of light green stuff is production forest, which and the very lightest green stuff is more private land, and then you've got medium green is the production forest, and then up in the top is more protection forest. So it's just kind of the lay of the land. And if you don't know where Java is, which would be really sad, take a look at that thing up in the corner there and imagine it. Okay, there we have it. Okay, now I will move on to my. Okay, in 2019. Help. The slide cannot go. Okay, in 2019, I visited my friend named Rupini early on a bright but cool morning in the Asian tropics. She was kneeling on the terrace of the house that she had built with savings from her work over 12 years as a live-in housekeeper and elder caregiver in Hong Kong. It was built on plantation land, forest plantation land, that neither she nor her husband owned. And this remittance house was made possible by Butini's care work abroad, stretching her forest plantation-based family's household to a distant urban area in Hong Kong. The house was one of 61 in a 12-hectare forest, worker settlement on an East Java, Indonesia pine plantation. More than 560 hectares of pine trees, elephant grass, coffee trees, and chili peppers grew around the settlement. With care, Teeny scrubbed the creases where the terrace's colorful floor tiles met the house's outer wall and corners. It was a piece of art. The structure evoked feelings of permanence and fixity. A fence of thick wrought iron enclosed the newly tiled porch where the house met the top of a steep cement-covered driveway. The inside contained 3 bedrooms and a front room for receiving guests, Javanese style. Butini had redesigned the kitchen, which occupied 2 large rooms. Her husband had cabinets and countertops made, components not often seen in rural Japanese kitchens. By January 2020, our research team's last visit before COVID hit, the back kitchen for cooking on a wood-burning 4-burner stove was not yet fully upgraded. Adjacent to the house on the northern side were 2 fully tiled bathrooms, one with a ceramic squat toilet, also rare. Both rooms were equipped with 3 by 6 foot ceramic tubs, each continuously and melodiously filling with clean spring water that was piped in from the mountain above. 5 cow pens sheltering 5 fat cows, 5 fat dairy cows, flanked the house on the western side under a tiled roof and atop a cement floor. Now, the very first house that we visited in this area was a majestic remittance house. This is it. And while the exact dimensions and demeanor of remittance houses varies widely across this forest settlement area, This once desperately, and I mean a few years before, desperately impoverished mountain area was now filled with houses. Not quite like this one, but still that were much improved. The very first house that we entered was owned by, had been recently built, we thought, by the Hamlet head, who declared as we walked into his house, this was in 2014, my wife built this house. Strange declaration, that's the first thing he said. But she's still in Hong Kong. His official title of Hamlet head belied a position that provided very little salary and gives you an idea of how poor everybody was, because he earned $3 a month for being the Hamlet head. Plus, he had a small piece of salary land that was rented out for 5 years, mostly because he had to pay off debts when he took on the job. Now, as in other mountain forests across East Java, forest plantation workers and their families live in these settlements, which are called Magarsaren, on national forest land that the State Forestry Corporation manages. This one, as I said, had 61 houses. All were in use from the time we arrived in 2014 until the present. And I'm going to show you a kind of, it's like a Google map thing that we added to. And that red boundary on the outside is are the boundaries of the Forest Village settlement. This is all what they call borrowed land. Magarsari, in fact, means borrowed land. It's a term that foresters borrowed themselves from a sultanate in Java's center, one that rendered forests, like the Sultan of Yogyakarta, state or institutional landlords, owners or controllers of much of the land in the surrounding environment. And in a forest worker settlement like this one, this forest worker patron-client-like relation has defined the shifting politics of access to land, housing, and work for more than 150 years of upland plantation politics. For the forest plantation, only 75 to 95 years, depending on what you count. But the reason that I'm throwing those numbers out is this is not the newfangled kind of plantation that is mostly spreading around the world at a moment in which populations are, people are all over the place, and many people are immediately cognizant of and experiencing dispossession in particular ways. A different thing that's happening on these kinds of plantations among the forest workers is that they are born proletarian, born into this landless working class that has only their own labor to support them. And they come from 4, 5, 6 generations of people, of parents and grandparents who were also born on plantations. Their experience, now I'm trying to think that today I'm not going to be able to go into this, but I'm trying to think through what that means in terms of how they experience these lives and what that means for their kind of, consciousness of their environment, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So the map gives you an idea of the state of the forest plantation around the settlement, but be careful. Those patches around it are not from shifting cultivation, as we might expect if we were seeing this without context. Java's forest history is very different from that on other Indonesian islands. Even though in the 19th century, there was still some shifting cultivation in some places, that's not happening anymore. It's not even a question. Okay, so Tini, her husband Kanto, and both their parents had lived all their lives on the state forest and private tea plantation that was on the southeastern slope of this mountain. Push this back to okay, they had all been born there, as I said earlier, and they had been told by foresters in the 1950s to build simple houses for themselves in this particular area. I'm going to try to show it to you with this little thing. Magarsari, this thing that says Magarsari right here. And that's where they moved into this area on the forest lands, and they built these houses. In fact, so Teeny's parents, in fact, had moved into this forest plantation, not in the 50s, but in the 1980s, because they were busy living on the tea plantation and working over there. And Teeny's father and his eldest son literally picked up the family's wood and bamboo house that he had built in 1963. And they carried it over the mountain into this particular place and set it up on the forest plantation. Remittance houses that are like those built by Teeny and Suki, the wife of the hammerhead, have changed agrarian landscapes all over the world. Remittance houses link agrarian land use change and migration. They're paid for with wages earned by migrant workers far from home and are most often built on land that's privately or communally held. Okay, and there's a famous book that was actually written by as a dissertation, first as an architecture student here on campus who wrote a book called The Remittance Landscape and the Remittance House. And she's talking about these houses that are built in Mexico on communally held land. And for many migrants, they represent proof that all those years spent working abroad were worth it in some way. They have something to show for it. This is one of the things that people continually say, why did you do it? You know, well, and this is why I wanted the house, because I have to have something to show for all that time that I was away from my kids. Okay. And so, you know, despite migrant workers' very deeply felt sacrifices and longing for family, the house displays something to them. But unlike the usual sites where remittance houses are built, those that concern us here are on plantation land, okay? Leased from the provincial state by agribusinesses, companies, or held by state land management institutions like the State Forestry Corporation, okay? And so, but these kinds of remittance houses characterize one of the key land use transformations that we see as part of the plantation-migration nexus. Okay, and this Magrasari is one of over 100 Magrasaran across Eastern Java. Okay, so this is not just a unique case. Now, I hope by now you're thinking there is really a weird anomaly, a puzzle. One of many here, of course, but involved in thinking about remittance houses built on plantation land to which workers have no formal rights. Okay, to answer this, if theoretically we're going to go into it, we'd move into revisiting classic agrarian questions of labor, about how capitalism affects rural labor, which I'm really not going to be able to detail in this talk. But why this is an anomaly also requires understanding the differences in forest and agrarian law in Indonesia, okay? Agrarian law pertains only to the governance of land in rural settlements, including agricultural land and house or yard land, okay? Forest land governs all land. Forest law, and on the other hand, governs all land in the national forest estate. It's really different. Until last year, just really 6 months ago or so, this land could not be converted to private land by any means. Once it's in the forest land, you know, famously, Indonesia's forest land was 70% when they first formed the forestry department in the 60s, and 30% was agrarian land. Okay. Of course, these things were differentiated more as the nation kind of went on, but still, there's these kind of basic things that make it impossible, or did make it impossible, to move from the forest land into the agricultural land. So from its inception then, the writing of forest law helped create what we call the political forest, one that is bounded and deeply controlled by foresters through territorializing practices, through the planting of certain species, and through the control of all human access to the forest. The exception, of course, was for the forest workers who were establishing these plantation forests that characterize Java's production forests today. And in fact, this was kind of a funny realization for me. I mean, I've been talking about political forests for a long time, and then I was talking about remittance forests, but what didn't really, you know, I mean, at least not on the recent round, you know, all production forests in Java are plantation forests. They're all already plantation forests, whether it's a teak forest, it's that the life cycle of the teak tree is between 60 and 80 years, you know, you know, these other kinds of trees, pine trees, they have a much shorter lifespan. And they're after the resin in it, you know, that's all part of the definitions of it, but these are all plantations, okay? So they share something with other plantation means of production or modes of production or whatever. So, so the presence of workers and their houses on the forest land is thus always a kind of anomaly. And there was always this idea, an underlying idea of a temporal limit, okay? The idea that this was really temporary housing, even when they ended up being there for 75 or more years. These guys went there. Many of them were on other parts of the forest and moved into this place in the 40s, 30s, or whatever, and then they moved on to the Magasari in 1951 or 52. Okay, so just looking at remittance houses on plantation land like Boutini's and Busuki's almost seems to scream anomaly, given the expectations of property theorists, like some of those in the audience, who assume that people who will not improve on land that is not owned. That is clearly not the case here. So my job here today is to show you why. So I'm going to talk about some ways that Javanese workers and their families have depended on plantation housing as part of the social reproduction of their families. But even though there's a lot of detail in this talk, there's not enough time to speak in the detail that I would love to impart to you. I do want to implant one idea for you to remember, and that is that on the forest plantation, we need to learn to see remittance houses in as highly political and politicized sites that represent not just a moment. Well, yes, just a moment, not a long period of time, but a moment in a trajectory of change. Okay, now that trajectory may be long or short, but that these plantations, including the forest plantation, justify their pressures on wages and prices for the commodities that forest workers produce by including access to forest-based housing in their wage. Okay, so these guys are getting ridiculously low wages, but the access to the housing is talked about as if it is part of their wage, and that has been the case since the very beginning. Okay, and this allowed for a long time also the State Forestry Corporation to say, if someone in this particular house, living in this particular house, is not working for the forestry guys, then see ya, and your family too. Okay, so there's a strong kind of tie in there. Okay, it's a very feudal relationship. It goes back to that long-term stuff I was talking about earlier about Java's cultural history. Okay, so but remittance houses today are one of the things that are pushing change. Okay, one way into this anomaly, of course, is to recognize that not all housing on plantation land was provided by the plantation, right? Magasari workers built their own simple houses on plantation land at the behest of the plantation managers. So they did a lot of stuff that shifting cultivators do, or that people, when they move at pioneering a new area, including this area, to settle, they had to, this on a steep mountain area. So they had to first flatten the land, take a cut out of the mountainside. They had to clear it. They cleared all the trees, you know, they clear all and burn and all of this. And there was slashing involved. There was, yeah, lots of burning involved. And basically then they would make the foundational area for the house and then collect forest products in the forest nearby, explicitly for building their house there. That's what they were told to do. You know, the things that they don't want the shifting cultivators to do on the forest lands, they were told to actually do when they were building a forest plantation. Okay. So all of these things, the tying the job to living in the house, doing these kinds of material practices that give rise to thinking about a different way of clearing a landscape and living in it and having some kind of control over it. All of these things uh, are being challenged by the provision of remittance houses. And in which now the congealed labor, or what Marx would call the congealed labor of its builders and funders, extending not only to the forest workers who built these houses, but to their wives, to their daughters, to their sisters who are going to Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, working over there, sending money back and sending the money to buy materials in order to build these houses, okay? Okay, so. Let's keep going. So, the remittance house is a material and a meaningful manifestation of what we call the plantation-migration nexus, and placed within a particular spatio-temporal moment. Until the rise of remittance houses on plantations, these power relations rarely favored the workers and families inhabiting them. As you all know, stories of plantations in the old days are not nice, even worse than the stories of plantations these days. Okay. Nevertheless, housing was a necessary component of plantation life in the late 19th and early 20th century. Okay. I am going to jump ahead. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about making this for forests. It's just a kind of sidebar here. It was going to be a major part of the talk, but I wasn't able to get everything I needed for this talk. So this is a blow up, obviously, of the close in of the research site, and one of the things that happened when the political forest was first being made in this area, which was in the 1930s, was that there was a rule. What was going on at that time? Well, this was one of the last places in Java to actually map all of the private land. Java, the entire private land base in Java was registered in a land cadastre. Type of land, was it for wet rice? Was it for irrigated? I mean, was it irrigated? Was it for dry crops? Was it for more or less agroforestry? Was it for house or settlement land? That kind of thing. Java was the only place where they had done all of this under colonialism. Okay, and the other thing was that the land that was considered customary by the Dutch at that time, land that was under settlements and land that was already in agriculture and in continuous agriculture. We all know that the reason that shifting cultivators in those old days lost a lot of their land was basically because it would have been stupid where they were doing their agriculture to actually be farming on it every single year, time after time. The place would be a mess. It wouldn't produce anything after a while, okay? And foresters at that time didn't get that. They just didn't understand how this kind of agriculture worked. So in any case, when they're doing this cadastre in Java, because there's still places where some of this is still going on, they had a rule that if the one rule was, if the agriculture had not been continuous for more than 3 years, then they didn't count it. They didn't know how to recognize certain environments. Same kind of thing happens, I'm sure, I know, in indigenous places in the United States, in other parts of the Americas, in Africa. The people that came in as colonial powers did not know how to see that landscape. Okay, so then they turned it into a rule of, because we can't see this, you can't have it. Okay, and so anything that was not being continuously cultivated was taken away. And in addition, what's the purpose of a land cadastre? Does anybody know what the real purpose of a land registration thing is for? Pardon me?
State formation, she said.
Yes, it is part of state formation. Very good. But like on the you and me level of things. Taxes! Taxes! you know, and this was the first time when in the process of this cadastre, that they were doing parcel taxes per person. That's a big deal. You know, like, wait a minute, I've been working, my family's been working this land for a long time. What the heck, you know? And no, that was why. So they had this other rule that if you said, no, I'm not paying you taxes, they said, fine, we'll take your land. It's gonna be part of the forest. Okay. Now, it is really hard to get specific data on that. And it really took me about 7 years to figure out how to do that, you know, and then to get the materials, because of course the foresters wouldn't give us their maps. And, I mean, now they do, now they do. I have lots of friends who are in that program now, and the forestry department's really changing a lot, but in the beginning, they don't, you know, they're trying to hang on to their land. And things are moving away. So these border areas, all the stuff that's the yellow with the red hatching, stripy little things. Stripes. That's private land. Now you see down the middle of that, of the area up there, there's some up there that is green, that's production forest. That's land that was taken away. Down here, right next to this other white thing, was another village. That green part was taken away. All these kind of edge places for some reason, but then that one that goes down through the middle, and it's a mystery. There's a couple of these little patches that, some are along rivers, obviously, and that was the time that they started taking riparian land away. Anyway, the red is what is land that was also taken away, that used to actually have a settlement on it, okay? And, you know, we went in there this summer and we mapped all these, that particular part of it. And you could actually still see where the land had been flattened. I'm not sure how to say this in English very well. Is there a term for this? Like when you flatten the land, is that what you say? Huh? Grading, yeah, grading, thank you. So, you know, the land had been graded, one plot by plot, you could still see that. You know, we're with a guy who knew who had these are all currently under agriculture. So they're kind of being disputed, but it's with permission because the law changed that people could start using the land in the remittance, in this now remittance forest. The actual forest law changed and gave people wider rights to the understory. Okay, so it's just kind of, we don't know how this is going to turn out in the long run, but it's kind of interesting to see. This was, I mean, there's so many stories about this place. And at the beginning, when we heard them, it was like they're from the mystical parts of time, you know, it's like, oh yeah, once there was a Sinden, who's a Javanese singer with a gamelan orchestra. And one time they found a Sinden who had died next to the river, and she was very beautiful, you know, all this kind of stuff. And then there's also a magic gamelan that the villagers could borrow. And the magic gamelan would appear if you had we're gonna have some kind of a life ritual event. You could go to a certain place in this forest and you know, so however you would request access to the gamelan, you would go through your rituals and so on. And the gamelan had to be returned in the same condition that it was brought, taken away. And one time, the strings that attach the different pieces of the gamelan to the gamelan instruments to itself, they broke. They were vines from the forest, and they broke. And the person who borrowed it returned the gamelan, having repaired those things, but they repaired them with rope. So it was as if the repairs were taking place in another world that was different from which the gamelan itself came, and no one ever was able to borrow the gamelan again. So that's a nice story. I have all kinds of ways of thinking about that in terms of people's relationships with the forest, but won't go into that right now. Anyway, this was a place that was heavily occupied, and yet, you see it says Selotiken Forest, okay? everyone knew Cerro Tican as a forest. No one knew that. Most people that we asked had no idea there had been people there. And yet, when we finally found somebody who knew about it, he said, yeah, before 1930, there were tons of houses in there and people were growing this and they were growing that and they're growing, and there was a whole area where they had pecan trees, which was basically poor people's opium. Now, some of you may not know that opium is not widely grown in Indonesia. It was one of the few places in Southeast Asia where it doesn't grow. And so, you know, they bought it. There was a huge network of selling it all over, particularly in these plantations. And anyway, so it's a named place. It's being used. It had social and political uses. There were histories there. And, you know, a lot of that just was lost or silenced when the Forest Department took it away. Okay, so I'm gonna do you guys all a big favor and not go into my detailed history and do a more recent detailed history. Yeah, let me just see what I have to get to start. I want to tell you about more about this remittance house thing, okay? So, okay. I'm going to start very recently for me, but probably before some of you guys were ever born, in 1997, 98. Who was born after, before? Who was not born in 1997? Be proud, be proud. I'm not telling you when I was born. Okay. Okay, so in 1997, 98, the Asian economic crisis, that was the big crisis in Asia, not this 2008 stuff. And other political crises and changes in Indonesian political economy. They brought most of the men who were by this time now working in cities, doing construction and so on, back to their village. Of course, they went because they weren't making enough money off forest work. There's a whole kind of history, I should say, of the forest being a refuge, even though it was a plantation, that people from other political, from various political structures, some very bad politics that happens in Indonesia between the 50s, 60s, 70s, so much violence, massacres, et cetera, and this was an area where the rubber plantation that I talked about earlier actually had a large Communist Party contingent. And you know, there's a lot to say about that particular situation, but other parts were in a different party, and I'm thinking now that their party politics basically saved them for a while. But that was the outcome, was that this Magasari grew from 12 houses, growing in the 50s, 60s, 70s. By 1977, there were 109 households. This was not natural population growth. This was population growth by migration, migration in. Okay, there weren't enough jobs for everybody. Okay, there just weren't, and so the houses extended from their original 12-hectare area all the way out for another 12 hectares. Foresters were not happy, but they were sympathetic. You know, there was a lot of really good stuff going on between local people and the foresters in this particular place at the time. Then the government launches a big transmigration program. 75% of the people that lived in that Magasari at that point in time moved to either Sumatra or to Borneo. Okay, sponsored by the state. Okay, so this again transformed the environment, right? Transform what's possible in that particular space. Allowed the foresters to replant the places that the people in their house. There develops a land market, an underground land market for compensation for moving to a better place in the Magasari. I mean, so there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the kind of ebbs and flows of this space. And yet there are also groups of people who were the stalwarts and who stayed. Okay, now, the AEC, the Asian Economic Crisis, was a monetary production crisis for investors and developers, but workers dependent on wages, it became a crisis of social reproduction. How are they going to move forward? Okay, you're going to hear the United States in this conversation, okay? In more recent years since COVID. Construction projects, urban development, all that slowed to a halt. Much of the work that was being done by migrating rural workers in the cities stopped. Even domestic workers returned to rural areas as their bosses' jobs or incomes were threatened. And there wasn't a lot of transnational migration yet, at least not from this place. In and around our forest village, our research villages, the forest, as elsewhere, other times, provided livelihood subsidies. In illegal logging was a particularly lucrative one, planting food crops in the forest, exploiting and selling firewood. Yet by 1999, when Taiwan and cities such as Hong Kong and Singapore began restructuring, the Indonesian government actually expanded their programs to facilitate transnational migration, and it was mostly for women, okay? And they did it in the field of domestic workers, okay? That's a long story in itself. Now, since 2000, nearly every family, and I think they were back up to, I don't know how many people then, but how many households there were, but nearly every family living on that forest plantation, and a majority of those on the nearby teak and rubber plantations, has seen one or more of their daughters, sons, parents, or siblings engage in long distance migration, but it's circular migration, right? That you can't go off and just become a citizen of somewhere. I mean, this is a problem, it's an issue in Asia too, and they started hardening their borders through bodily borders, racialized borders, all kinds of things, right? So, people are going for circular migration. Long distance life labor, in fact, has become a new normal. The younger generation today, if you can believe this, plans for it. They want to go, okay? The direction of migration that's related to these montane plantations has followed a path that was initiated by transmigration in the sense that it reversed the direction of migration entirely outward, okay? While the congealed labor that's fixed in those remittance houses has become a major feature of the plantation landscape, shaping the visuals of the plantation migration complex. Okay. Now, what happened? Okay, and remittance houses on these montane plantations emerged only in the 21st century. Okay, so around 2000, maybe more like 2006, you start getting a little bit here, a little bit there. What I would like to do is talk a little bit about how this worked. So Sukanto and Tini, for example, lived in a woven bamboo house in the Magasari from the time they were married in 1993 until 2002. Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm very, very sorry here. You just have to wait. Then you're really in trouble. Okay. Here's what I thought. Okay. They lived in this woven bamboo house. Okay, in 1998, with the downfall of the dictator Suharto, who had ruled for 32 years, forest violence racked these forests from about 1999 to 2004. Even though the Magasari residents were only minimally involved, the village head of the village next door was actually selling timber, rented a warehouse, was openly, had gangs of guys going out into the forest and cutting down these pine trees, which they were resin trees. So I don't know, they're selling it for logs, but in any case, some people made a lot of money off that, but for others, the people who were the workers and involved in this, it was they weren't making that much money, but it was something to do. Foresters were afraid to confront illegal loggers because they were in such large gangs. Though resin production actually continued. Local individuals and extra local gangs felled some of those trees. They created also canopy gaps where the Magrasati and village residents were able to plant corn and chilies. And they also started to plant grass. Now, in the midst of these tensions, Teeny left the village in 2000, signing a 2-year contract to work as a domestic in Hong Kong. Not long after, with some early remittances sent home, Sukanto sold their Magrasati house plot and bought another site, paying a hefty compensation fee for the work by the previous occupants who prepared the site. After Teeny completed her first contract, she sent money to Kanto to buy a pregnant dairy cow and to begin buying materials to be used in the house. They were able to take advantage of the infrastructure for milk, refrigeration that was put into place from an earlier government project, but was put in place basically to benefit village elites in villages down the hill. But what happened now as these women were going off and working, they weren't certainly making enough of a surplus. They weren't able to save enough to buy pieces of land yet. Land in Java, very expensive. Even if it's not expensive, it's expensive. And so instead, they saw this success of this dairy cow project and all of the, you're in the tropics with dairy cows, you need to have refrigeration. All of the infrastructure for that went in to benefit these village elites. And basically it was there for anybody who wanted to bring in their milk on a daily basis and they joined the cooperative and went on with it. So they started buying these cows and they bought them for cash. Okay, so the cows are their bank. You know this story in many places. The cows are literally their bank because they buy them for cash. And then they would also, when the cows got to production moment, I mean, it's also a cycle that they would be using the milk for daily social reproduction. When some big expense came up, either for the direct buying of materials for those houses, or for buying a motorcycle to take the kids to school or going into the forest. Now they're planting elephant grass in the forest, and everybody's doing it. And it turns out that it was already legal, but none of the foresters told them. And now eventually it all kind of worked out. And basically the whole forest is now mostly elephant grass and pine. And in fact, in terms of biomass, if you're to measure it, I'm sure that you would come out with much more biomass being produced in the form of this, giant grass. I mean, I gave a talk one time, and a friend who works in Africa, Jim Ferguson, said, Nancy, I enjoyed your talk, but looking at those forests with elephant grass all over the place made me think of fire, 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 fire. But these are so heavily managed, the numbers of cows are increasing. Because they have the ability to subsidize their costs of production from planting this grass in the forest. It's not all that the cows need, but it's a good portion of it to do that on a regular basis. Okay, almost done. So as more Magrasati and plantation residents migrated to work overseas, the number of cows penned next to their owners' houses on the plantations increased. So everybody, this was the other thing that was just shocking to me when I first went there. Every single person, and we're talking, forest workers, poor. I mean, urban workers now are more poor, urban dwellers, poverty, you think about this stuff. But these are the guys that, nobody wanted to be. Forest workers living in these places, they had nothing. And now, when I got there in 2014, the village had said, I said, so, there's a lot of cows around here. Do people up there have cows? Yeah, they all have cows. And I said, well, how many people don't have cows? I mean, is there a big difference between the people? No, everybody has a cow. And I didn't believe her, and it turned out to be the case. And this was dependent on these people going outside and sending money. During Teeny's second contract, Sukanto collected grass in the forest and around the edges of the village. He milked the cows. He sold milk. He had their cow artificially inseminated. They don't have any bulls in this village, no bulls, all artificial. Pine resin collection also provided him regular income, though the work is very heavy. Pine resin is not rubber. You know, you put pine resin into these big containers, and then you have to carry them. Well, now that they could have motorbikes, they would put the pine resin carriers into the back of the motorbike and then carry it to the collection point. Okay, more and more women were migrating, more and more women were sending home remittances that provided cash for social reproduction, cows for savings, and more cash to buy housing materials. After the forest violence in 2005-06, Sukanto and the other Magresari residents began to claim spaces on the forest land between the pines to grow that elephant grass I was just telling you about and feed the family cows. He acquired 1.5 hectares of forest land through planting labor, and that is a fortune in land. I gotta tell you, I don't know anyone in Java that has 1.5 hectares of land. It's like, you know, they're down to, so fragmentation is such a big deal on private land. It's like ridiculously a lot of land. The land was scattered through the forest. And by 2018 or so, the entire production forest understory was controlled by the Magresari and residents of the forest adjacent hamlets. So via cows and the new political economies of raising livestock, migrant women's income invested in dairy cows changed the livelihood profiles of their families and the montane landscape. They created the new political forest, and it was a remittance forest. Teeny came home for several years. She had a kid. She worked another six years in Hong Kong after that, returning in late 2017. Over the last 6 years that she worked in Hong Kong, she and her husband bought sand for cement, foundation stones, and wood for the walls and ceiling supports by selling 3 of their cows. Sukanto hired local woodworkers or carpenters to make those kitchen cabinets and block out the interior rooms. When we met Sukanto for the first time in 2015, before Teeny returned home, he had no cows left and he was living in the half-built house. I can show you that. Okay, so this is the mosque in the front, this is on forest land. And in the back, you can see a house that's being constructed, which I blew up a little bit on the other side. Okay, so he's living in this thing. And in the back, I guess, maybe had more protection from the rain. But, yes, Teeny's eldest daughter, who was 15 at the time, she had left in 2014 for Hong Kong, opting out of high school to help her mom. This one child being cared for, the one child was being cared for then by Teeny's parents while she was away. When Teeny returned for good, she used her savings to complete the house, its terraces, its bathrooms, and the front kitchen, as described in the introduction. She bought more pregnant cows to save for her son's upcoming wedding, and she started to pay back her parents by contributing money to kind of fix up their house as well. Teeny and Sukanto, like their neighbors, rode every day into the forest plantation on the motorbike that she purchased and collected the elephant grass he had planted between the pines. So Boutini's remaking her house into a remittance house was a quiet yet clear political statement, repeated in practice by most other Magresari residents. They were not given specific permission to renovate. They hadn't asked. After all, they built and owned the house. And this reminds me that there was a big piece of the story earlier that I had to cut out, and that is that there is a tradition in Java. It's not that commonly used, but there is a tradition in which houses and even crops can be owned by somebody else and on Javanese land. So in fact, this whole thing of being what we call dependent, or numpang is the phrase, this patron-client relationship, that started with smallholders and peasants or petty commodity producers, whatever you want to call them. It was something that was happening on private land and would happen a lot in areas where, especially like mountains, where there's not that much arable land. There's not even that much land you can turn into house land because, you know, it's a big job to kind of grade it. And so first the tea plantation, which came in around the mid 1800s, around 1850 or so. The tea plantation first uses forced labor, which was a thing then. And basically, yeah, very coerced labor for taxes. And then in the around 1900, they started depending much more on the quote unquote free or dispossessed labor market. And people were coming in and working there. They also used this idea of people borrowing their land. So the tea plantation becomes the landlord, and the client or the dependent is the worker who's making a little house on the land. Then 70 years later, when they're doing this in the forest plantation, I mean, we're talking feudal institutions, and that's not like used figuratively. Feudal, feudalism. That's what's happening in 1952 after Indonesia is independent. So these guys, I mean, they're using the same idea that you are our dependent, our client, we're the patron, and that whole patriarchal kind of idea that goes with that. Okay, so this is the, and that's the trajectory that I'm talking about. On the one hand, there were, you know, there's increase and decrease in the number of people who are living on the forest lands and who are depending on it, and they've been given permission to live there. I mean, there were some really bad times, and these foresters were like, yes, come and stay, it's fine, just make a house over there, whatever, you know. But after a while, it just got to be too much for the environment, for the jobs, for these people. They couldn't socially reproduce. So you have the kind of rise and fall of that. But then you also have this kind of movement of these institutions, and it has consequences, and it comes forward into the present time. So we asked, I mean, we didn't get it. You know, why did Teeny and other women make houses that were so big and beautiful there and so fancy? And if you did try to move them, all the stuff would fall down. They'd have beautiful tiles and things like that. And they finally said, they kind of felt that the foresters would not dare let them evict them, would not evict them. Okay, the foresters also at this point still needed a resident for workforce to achieve their resident quotas and protect the remaining forest. The cows were competing with them. I mean, people were able to live because the foresters had let these cows come on the land. And so, you know, instead of having this rule where everybody had to live everybody that lived in a house on the forest land had to work for the foresters. We have 61 guys that would be willing to do this. And it was only guys who did this work in this particular village. Okay, so that's another reason a lot of the people that went off migrating were women, because the jobs that secured the house were held. Okay, and they were allowed to, not that they had a contract or anything like that, but they had the jobs. Okay, so you had this job and house connection, and you know, the women didn't have those kind of connections. As the other plantations started going into decline, more and more of them really needed to go somewhere else in order to work. So, I mean, it seems really logical when I'm talking about all of this, but you know, when you walk in and this is what's already going on, or if I had walked into this place 6 months ago, and they were measuring the houses in the Magrasati, all 61 of them, in order to take them out of the forest and give people certificates, what do you call it, land titles. I would never in a million years ever believe that would happen. And B, you know, you don't see all this complex, you know, human environment interaction because of class-based ideas about who gets access to land and where you can build a house. And then the plantations coming in and taking over, the rising and falling of the population, the changing in the forest crops from mahogany to pine so that more people could work. I mean, just there's so many things. And they get lost when you see, oh, they're taking the land out of the forest and putting it back into. So some of that land that you saw, it's only housing land. It's not the, if you remember the map that had the red stuff on it. That's all agricultural land. That's in the forest and they're not taking that out, but people are controlling it already. So in conclusion, I hope I've shown you that mobility as well as settlement are always political acts and part of trajectories of land-labor relations locally and stretched distances. We've seen that even land can move and cows can be settled. Building a remittance house is also a political act, but one that produces fixity and resists being moved off the land. However, the things that I've described to you today do need to be seen as strategic practices that are attacking the status quo, what Gramsci called wars of position. In other words, land and labor politics are the stuff of production and reproduction in rural areas, and always have been. Generational differences, at least 2 generations of migrants since 2000, also pertain. G's, Mrs. G's 5 children mentioned in the beginning quote in this talk are buying small tracts of private land in cities and in other villages, small, 1,000 meters square, 500 meters square to build a house. They don't want to be farmers and they, can't plant very much on 500 square meters. They buy the land to build and renovate houses, to set up small businesses, or in a pinch, to have their family live in while they return to migrate. Beyond the scope of this paper is a new development, which I already mentioned to you, so I'm not going to say it again. And that has to do with taking this land out of the forest. Pine resins also become a much more important forest product because of this history, not only because of the events that were here in this forest, but because that forest violence was at its worst in the teak forest, and they lost probably a good half of their standing stock in that violence at that time. So the idea that housing residence was always tied to forest work is also no longer a thing. I was saying that this was a problem when you had 60% of the people on the forest, in that forest settlement, don't want to be working pine resin. They want to work with their cows. And they want to work with their cows, not because they want to somehow, after 5 generations, turn into peasants. It's because, it's a commodity and they are small commodity producers. The foresters had to come up with a new policy, and they came up with a policy of having a resin quota. So you're seeing all this kind of adaptation, one set of people to another set of people, and under these conditions, these guys are allied, and under those conditions, those guys are allied. And I think it's important to know those background circumstances rather than walking into the place and go, oh, they're finally getting that house land back that they've lived in for 75 years. So long distance transnational migration, while difficult, has empowered the landless women laborers related to forest workers. The current modalities of mobile labor, working off the plantation, the inadequate plantation wages, and the lack of well-paid local jobs for women have all underlain the drive of mobile laborers to work transnationally, improving their working conditions and living conditions back on the plantation. That's why I say remittance houses on plantations emplace the congealed labor of local and transnational workers, and they represent the currently declining power and authority of that early form of political forest. So we're really seeing how co-production has actually worked in this place in a kind of interesting and unique way. So, yeah. I think these kind of complex land transformations have significance for plantation workers across Indonesia and worldwide, even though they will take different forms in different places. They add complexity to agrarian questions of labor, plantation labor, as entangled production and social reproduction politics and practices. Thank you. I had it. Okay. Thank you for staying, what? Long time afterwards. Any quick questions?
Nancy, they're selling some of the milk too?
Oh, yeah, there's a whole cooperative situation.
That's the market.
That's what they have to do every day. They take it to the refrigeration.
So they
place.
just sell it home, and sell the rest.
They don't use any.
They don't use it.
No,
Okay,
there's not a milk drinking culture.
not enough what?
Not a milk drinking culture.
Okay, and then I thought you said that, but that's my mistake. And then did they harvest the elephant grass and feed it to the cows?
Yes,
Or-
yeah, because the cows have to be penned. Since they put this forest up, cows are not allowed.
Okay,
That's big. No.
Yeah.
So they make the pens. And those are kind of permanent too, because dairy cows need to have that clean space underneath. And they've worked it all out. I mean, this was like, they didn't have these kind of cows.
And do they make silage? Do you know about?
What is
It's
silage?
fermented grass.
Not that I know of. Oh, no, they run out of grass. They run out of 560 hectares of grass. And then they buy, what they call momol, which is it's the non-sugar parts of sugarcane that's grown down in the lowlands. Yeah, Michael.
Two questions, Sandy, about your conceptual framing. One is, you said, migration and, plantations are the two most important trends in the rural areas today.
Mhm.
But you also know that Lenin wrote about 100 years ago, that capitalism at the core creates a contradiction in the rural area, which drives folks, non-wage folks, to the center from rural areas. So you know that that's happening arguably for since the modern era. So what is so poignant to you in this movement that you say that migration is one of the most important trends? That's the first question. Second
You're
question.
gonna have to remind me.
Second question is, your use of social reproduction. So, I agree, it's sort of messy, sticky, non-economic stuff that new things like.
Yeah,
But a lot of what you're describing, I would argue, is about the social relations to production
that's right. And so the
and not social reproduction. So where are you drawing that line?
okay, I'm not drawing any lines, but there's also a whole kind of body of theory on that talks about how social reproduction and production, particularly in certain contexts, can't be separated. I mean, how do you separate that in this kind of system of production that I just talked about? I actually can do it. I mean, it's really difficult. And I think that's something that goes back to early debates, particularly by feminists, political feminists. What was the first one again? Oh,
My question-
did I not agree with Lenin after all these years? No, I don't agree with Lenin after all these years. And boring, that's boring. Yeah, that's the boring stuff. This is so much more exciting. I mean, you have dearth and surplus people and surplus populations and foresters and farmers and cows and, so much more exciting. Revolution. Sorry, anyway, yeah. I don't really have an answer to that. And also, here,
I'm unrelated to that.
I don't know your name. My name.
I'm related to that. I'm wondering what sort of migration internal to Java these remittances are made possible, because you're talking about remittance houses being built on plantations, which sounds like you kind of as a whole thing. And so as the populations increase, are they coming from families on the plantation? is it re-migration of kids back on the plantation, or is it moving urban to rural happening? That you know?
Yeah, I think I was probably not clear enough about this in the beginning, but that was like that's what they did first. You know,
And
you
it's
go,
also-
pardon me?
Sorry, it's also people who are buying plots, small plots in urban areas as well.
Yeah, but I mean, not metro Jakarta, you know, small cities, other villages. Yeah, no, but the thing is. Oh, there's so many questions within that one question. All the people that I talked about in here have worked in, they did all farm, I mean, migration's not new. Migration is a long time ago and it has not gotten the attention from agrarian studies that it should get. It's all bad, always all bad, all this or that. And it's so it becomes this thing like, oh, they're taking the houses off the forest lands. Isn't that nice? That migration, okay, we're hearing some pretty damn bad stories about migration in this country and the borders and it's horrific. It's horrific. But you know, as a practice and as a something in all over Southeast Asia, people migrated. What depends how you define it. And Java's had, it's not just because there's like more population. It's because there's been a class system in place in Java for at least 800 years. I mean, literally, I mean, there's a famous book called Java in the 14th century. And he's talking about stuff that was going on in the 10th century. You had these people who had the land and then other people were following them. And it was class and caste and all that kind of thing. So off-farm labor, yes. The pay was terrible. All they could do was simple reproduction, if that. So, I mean, you know, there's another kind of story here where these women are being domestic workers and they're going to Hong Kong and they're working in other people's families. And then using their savings from that, you know, they're helping that family socially reproduce, they're doing the socially reproductive labor, doing all that kind of care stuff. That's a big part of the social reproductive. But then they go back and they do other things with what they've saved. They could not do that before. That's why this is only happening on the plantation since the Asian economic crisis and people. On the plantation, migration in a big way, lots of circular migration. That's been happening on from private lands and cities and all over the place, going overseas through government-backed institutions and yeah, so that's not new. But yeah, I think I answered your question. Yeah. Aaron.
Yeah, so I was just kind of thinking in the context, like, larger, like, I guess, like, geopolitical dynamics in the region, like, maybe less so Singapore, more like Hong Kong, Taiwan, really like challenges, like, their economy, and I think likely, like, okay, particularly in Hong Kong, thinking about China's role, what that might be like immigration policy or like the economy. Is there concern that these like full remittance economies are like precarious and that like changes in some of the countries where people are going might result in like a big loss in potential, like earnings? Or is that like, I guess like, yeah.
I'm sure that's a
concern
for some people. I'm sure that's a concern for some people, but like with COVID, a lot of the people, well, some of the stories that we heard were that people were actually being put on planes from Hong Kong and dumped somewhere, dropped somewhere, sent somewhere. But I don't know how the guys that I knew got around this, but that didn't happen to anybody from NY work. They almost all go to Hong Kong. They choose by the employment agency that they go to what their destination is going to be. So you notice I wasn't talking at all about any kind of migration to the Middle East. These guys made explicit decisions not to go to the Middle East because of the horror stories that were coming out of there. So these things kind of, and that's kind of related to what you talked about. I mean, when things sound so bad that people just don't go there. I mean, even like, the son of the woman who was in Hong Kong for 24 years. She has one son who said, I'm never migrating. I didn't get to see my mother the whole time, blah, 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 blah. The other son is like, okay, I'm going to Japan. And I can get a good job, and I can get a good job working on a farm, raising cows, and they're gonna pay me this amount of money. And they paid him tons and tons of money. But he felt that it didn't live up to what they said that they were gonna pay him. So he finished out the contract and left, and then now he's trying to get into Australia. I mean, you get these people who are actually, I mean, and this is not a rich guy. He doesn't have anything, So it's really gonna be interesting to kind of look at this next generation and what they do and how they work it, and then what happens beyond that. So, yeah, it's hard to say. I think it's partly an empirical question. It's a really good question, but I think you'd have to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, I'm the horrible person that has to say, maybe we could move on to the social hour.
Have a great.
And Nancy will answer any questions.
Okay, but I can only stay for 5 minutes. I'm sorry. It's my son's birthday. I have to go.